I am Queequeg, a native of the faraway island of Kokovoko. As a boy, I was raised in the customs of my people, with a deep reverence for the sea and the art of hunting. In our world, the ocean was both a sanctuary and a provider, as it had been for generations. Little did I know that one day, the vast and mysterious waters would be my path to a new destiny one I had not imagined. My story begins not on my island, but in the bustling port of New Bedford, where fate introduced me to Ishmael, a thin and curious man. I remember the first time I saw him, sitting quietly at the far end of the inn where I had sought shelter. His eyes held a kind of weariness, as if he too had seen the world's depths. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were soft, like someone who had learned much and yet still wondered at the mysteries of life. I could sense that Ishmael was like me, though perhaps in a different way. I had come from a place where every wave carried meaning, every gust of wind whispered stories, but he had come from a faraway land, seeking answers in the vastness of the sea. We were both searching, he for something unknown, I for something beyond my island. When I first agreed to board the Pequod, I had little understanding of the world I was about to enter. I had heard of whaling, of course, but I had never imagined that the life of a sailor would be so strange. The Pequod was a ship like no other I had ever seen. Its men, hardened and rough, seemed like shadows of the sea itself, toughened by years of exposure to the elements, shaped by their endless journeys. And then there was Captain Ahab. Even as I laid eyes on him for the first time, there was something unmistakable in his presence. Ahab was not a man like the others. His gaze was intense, filled with a kind of sorrow that seemed to haunt him. His eyes, sharp as knives, looked not just at the world around him, but into it. There was something about him, something that drew me in but also made me wary. His power, his influence over the men was palpable, but I couldn't help but wonder what lay beneath the surface of that commanding exterior. The first time I saw him speak, I was struck by how little he said, and yet how much those few words carried. Ahab was a man of few needs, but when he spoke, his voice seemed to command the air itself. He spoke little to the crew, but often looked out over the ocean, as if the waves whispered only to him. But what did Ahab truly seek? I began to wonder if he sought something more than just the whale. Was it vengeance, redemption, or perhaps he was seeking something that none of us would ever truly understand? And yet, as the days passed, and I found myself drawn into the rhythm of ship life, I began to notice the growing tension. Ahab's obsession with the great white whale, Moby-Dick, was like a shadow cast over the crew. It wasn't just a hunt for a whale, it was a quest for something deeper, something dangerous. The other sailors, caught in his fever, did not ask questions, but I did. I was the outsider, the one who saw things differently. As we sailed out into the open ocean, I couldn't help but feel that we were all running away from something. I too had left my home, but for reasons of discovery, not escape. Ahab, however, seemed driven by something darker, a need to confront the very forces of nature itself. The ocean, which had always been a symbol of mystery and beauty to me, was now a battlefield. Ahab's need for vengeance against Moby-Dick began to shape everything on the Pequod. Every wave, every gust of wind seemed to carry the scent of something coming, something inevitable. But as I stood on the deck, watching the horizon stretch endlessly before us, I couldn't help but wonder, were we chasing Moby-Dick, or were we chasing something far more elusive, something within ourselves? Was Ahab's obsession truly about the whale, or was it about something deeper, something he could never grasp? In the midst of all this, Ishmael remained quiet, watching the unfolding events with a calmness that both puzzled and intrigued me. He was different from the others, more introspective, yet he too had joined the hunt. What was he searching for? What did he hope to find in the vast emptiness of the sea? We sailed further into the unknown, and with each passing day, I felt the weight of Ahab's obsession pulling us deeper into the abyss. And yet I was not sure if any of us were truly prepared for what awaited us. As we journeyed forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that the whale was not the only force we would have to confront. But perhaps, as we moved further from shore, we were all chasing something, chasing the past, chasing redemption, or perhaps just chasing the unknown. The sea had always been a place of discovery for me, but with Ahab at the helm, I wondered if we were discovering something about ourselves that none of us could control. And so I kept my eyes on the horizon, feeling the pull of the deep ocean and the unanswered questions swirling in my mind. What awaited us in the waters ahead? And perhaps more importantly, what would we find within ourselves when we finally came face to face with the great white whale? As the days drifted by on the Pequod, I began to notice how the ship's crew, though hardened by the sea, was not immune to the shadow of Ahab's presence. The man's obsession with Moby-Dick seemed to grow each day, his every action tethered to the memory of that great white whale. The crew followed his lead with fervor, as if each man believed that chasing the whale would somehow absolve them of their own personal ghosts. But not all of us were so easily swept up in the tide of Ahab's madness. I had spent much of my life surrounded by the sea, but it was in the eyes of Ahab that I saw the ocean's true danger, not in its storms or in its waves, but in the depths of the human soul. Ahab's eyes were like two black holes, pulling everything into them until there was nothing left but an insatiable hunger for revenge. His obsession with Moby-Dick was not just a hunt, it was a compulsion, a need to confront something far beyond the physical world. I remember the first time I saw Ahab truly speak to the crew. It was after we had sailed for several weeks without sighting the whale, and tension had begun to mount on the ship. Ahab called the men to the deck. There was no ceremony, no grand speech, just the deep, rumbling sound of his voice commanding our attention. His words were simple, yet filled with such power that they seemed to carve through the air itself. "Aye, lads, there she blows. We sail towards Moby-Dick now," he said, his voice laced with both reverence and hatred. "This hunt is no ordinary chase. It is my vengeance, my claim to fate itself. You will follow me, for you have no choice, and if you die with purpose. The white whale is no mere creature. He is the very embodiment of nature's wrath." At that moment, something inside me shifted. I had heard many men speak of the sea in poetic terms, romanticizing it as a source of life and adventure. But Ahab's words stripped away all the poetry, revealing the darker side of the ocean, its unforgiving nature, its boundless cruelty. There was no awe in his words, only a deep and palpable fury. Despite this, there was something magnetic about Ahab. His passion, his relentless pursuit of the whale, drew the men to him like moth to a flame. It was impossible not to be swept up in his fervor. And yet I remained distant, my thoughts clouded with doubts that I did not fully understand. I had seen many things in my life, but I had never seen a man consumed so wholly by something as Ahab was consumed by Moby-Dick. As the days passed, I began to notice the other men too, falling under Ahab's spell. They spoke of the whale with awe, as if it were a god or a demon, something more than an animal. The crew, once a diverse collection of men from all walks of life, now seemed to merge into one singular entity, all driven by the same purpose. They were not chasing a whale. They were chasing something they could not name, something they could never truly possess. I too felt the pull of Ahab's madness, though I tried my best to remain unaffected. It was in my nature to stay quiet, to observe, to distance myself from the chaos that others seemed to revel in. But even I could not ignore the growing tension in the air. Every day, the ship seemed to drift farther from the world I knew and closer to something more primal, more dangerous. One evening, as I sat near the bow of the ship, staring out at the endless expanse of water, Ishmael approached me. His face was drawn, his eyes tired. He had begun to show signs of the same weariness that I had seen in Ahab, though his reasons were not as clear. "I wonder, Queequeg," he said quietly, sitting down beside me, "if any of us really understand what we're doing here. What is it that Ahab seeks? What is it that drives him so, and why are we all so eager to follow him into this madness?" I turned to Ishmael, my eyes meeting his. He had always been a curious man, always questioning, always seeking meaning. I admired that about him, though I knew he was not like me. He did not understand the sea in the same way I did, and perhaps that was why he could not grasp the depths of Ahab's obsession. But I understood. In my own way, I had felt it too. "Ahab is a man of vengeance," I said slowly, my voice steady, but filled with the weight of my own thoughts. "But vengeance is a heavy burden, Ishmael. It wears a man down, twists him into something unrecognizable. He is not chasing Moby-Dick, he is chasing something else, a need to prove himself, to confront the very nature of the world itself. Perhaps he seeks power over nature, or perhaps he simply wants to understand it, but in the end, he may find that there are forces greater than man's will, forces he cannot control." Ishmael nodded slowly, his brow furrowed in thought. "But will we be able to stop him? Or will we all be swept away by the tide of his obsession?" "We cannot stop him," I replied, my voice quiet. "Not unless he chooses to stop himself." That night, as the wind howled and the waves crashed against the hull of the ship, I lay in my hammock, unable to sleep. The thought of Ahab's obsession gnawed at me, and I could not shake the feeling that we were all being drawn into something far larger than any of us could comprehend. The hunt for Moby-Dick was no longer just a hunt for a whale, it was a hunt for meaning itself, and I feared that the price of that meaning would be our souls. As the Pequod sailed deeper into the ocean, I could feel the weight of Ahab's presence growing heavier with each passing day. His obsession, once an undercurrent, was now the very foundation of our journey. We had become mere instruments of his will, caught in the tide of his madness. And though I had joined this journey willingly, I could not help but wonder if it was already too late for any of us to turn back. But perhaps that was the nature of the sea once you set sail. There is no turning back. You are carried forward toward whatever fate the waves have in store for you. And so we continued. The Pequod moved steadily forward, its crew driven by the will of a man who had long ago given himself over to a force greater than any of us could fathom. The sea stretched endlessly before us, its mysteries beckoning, its dangers waiting. We were not just chasing Moby-Dick anymore, we were chasing something far more elusive, a confrontation with the very heart of nature, and with the darkness that lurks within each of us. Days turned into weeks, and as the Pequod sailed ever deeper into the wild, untamed waters, I found myself becoming increasingly aware of the toll this journey was taking on us all. The men, once jovial and full of life, now carried an unsettling quietness, a tension that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Every passing day seemed to bring us closer to Moby-Dick, but it also drew us further from the men we once were. Ahab had become a shadow of himself, though I did not know if that shadow was something he had always been, or if it was a new creation, born of the obsession that consumed him. I had watched him closely for weeks now, seen how his every thought, every action, seemed to revolve around one thing: the whale. To the crew, Ahab was a god, a force of nature they could not deny. But to me, he was a man, and a man whose soul was slowly unraveling bit by bit as he pursued the white whale. It was one night, while the moon hung low over the dark water, that I saw something in Ahab that unsettled me to my core. We were standing on deck, and he was alone, gazing out at the dark horizon. There was something about the way he looked at the water, something that spoke of a deep, unrelenting hunger. He did not seem to notice me at first, but when I stepped closer, he turned, his eyes locking with mine. There was no anger in them, no fury, only the cold, empty weight of someone who had given everything up in the name of one single purpose. "Queequeg," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Do you know what it is to chase something so long, so desperately, that you lose yourself in the hunt?" I had never heard him speak with such vulnerability. For a brief moment, Ahab seemed human again. But only for a moment. The mask of obsession quickly returned. "I know what it is to chase," I replied quietly, looking out over the dark sea. "I chase the horizon, the unknown, the depths of the ocean. But I do not hunt with anger." Ahab's lips curled slightly, as if my words held some hidden meaning for him. "You do not understand, Queequeg. This is not just a hunt. This is fate. My fate. And Moby-Dick is the one who has chosen me. It is not I who chase the whale, it is the whale who chases me." I did not respond immediately. The wind howled through the rigging, and for a moment the only sound was the creaking of the ship and the splash of the waves. Ahab stood still, as if lost in his thoughts, and I realized that I was too. Was Ahab right? Was this truly a battle of fate? Or was it simply the folly of a man consumed by his own desire for vengeance, one who had lost sight of the very thing that made him human? The question gnawed at me, but I could not find the answer. "Do you ever wonder," I asked slowly, "whether Moby-Dick is just a part of nature, like any other creature? That perhaps he is not our enemy, but simply a force we cannot control?" Ahab turned sharply, his eyes flashing with a fury that sent a chill down my spine. "Moby-Dick is no mere animal, Queequeg. He is the embodiment of all that is wild, all that is untamed. He is the great enemy of man, the one force we cannot conquer, and I will not rest until I have done so." There was no more room for discussion after that. Ahab's mind was set, and there was no place for doubt or reason in his heart. He had become a man whose soul was entirely devoted to one singular purpose: to kill Moby-Dick. But even then, even as Ahab's obsession grew, I could not bring myself to completely abandon him. There was something about him, something in his voice, in the intensity of his gaze, that made me feel as if I too had a part to play in this drama. Perhaps it was the sea itself, this vast, unknowable force, that made us all feel so small, so insignificant. And perhaps that was why Ahab sought the whale. Perhaps in some twisted way, he believed that killing Moby-Dick would finally give him mastery over the forces that governed his life. As the days went by, I watched the men of the Pequod become more and more attuned to Ahab's obsession. They no longer spoke of anything other than the whale. The entire ship was consumed by the hunt, and yet, As we sailed farther into the unknown, I began to wonder, were we hunting Moby-Dick, or were we hunting something else entirely? Each time Ahab spoke of the whale, it felt less like a creature and more like a symbol of all the struggles that men face in their lives. The need to control, to conquer, to master the world around them. But the sea does not care for men's desires. It does not answer to their will. The ocean is vast and indifferent, and Moby-Dick, I began to believe, was merely a reflection of that indifference. Still, Ahab's passion was contagious. It seeped into the hearts of the men who now saw the whale as the ultimate test, the ultimate challenge. They no longer questioned Ahab's motives. They simply followed him, drawn into his madness. But I could not shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. This was no longer a journey to catch a whale, it was a journey into the heart of darkness itself, and we were all being swept along by the current. And so, we sailed. We sailed toward Moby-Dick, toward the confrontation that seemed inevitable. But in the depths of my heart, I wondered, would we find what we sought? Or would we only find destruction? The sea stretched before us, as endless as our thoughts, as vast as the questions that lingered in our minds. The hunt had begun, and we were all players in a game that none of us truly understood. But we continued anyway. The days on the Pequod passed slowly as we ventured deeper into the open ocean. The rhythm of the ship's creaking timbers, the sound of the waves crashing against the hull, the constant, steady hum of the wind through the sails became a part of me. There was something strangely hypnotic about the sea, something that calmed the soul even as it stirred the blood. But beneath that calm, a storm was brewing. I could feel it in the air, in the very movement of the ship. It was a tension I had never known before, a sense of inevitability that seemed to wrap itself around us. The hunt for Moby-Dick had begun in earnest. Ahab had kept the men on edge, always looking, always waiting for the slightest sign of the whale's presence. He had set his sights on something beyond the horizon, something that had become not just a creature, but a symbol of something far greater. To Ahab, Moby-Dick was not just a whale. He was the embodiment of nature's power, the force of the universe that could not be controlled, the very thing that had defied Ahab in the past. And now, Ahab would not rest until he had claimed victory over it. The crew had come to accept this relentless pursuit, though I could see the weariness in their eyes. They followed Ahab not out of loyalty to him as a man, but because they had become part of something larger than themselves, something they could not understand but could not escape. The sea had a way of drawing people in, of making them forget their lives ashore, of making them forget who they had been before they stepped onto the ship. And now we were all part of Ahab's madness, bound to it by a force we could neither comprehend nor resist. It was during one of these long stretches of waiting that I began to see the true cost of Ahab's obsession. The crew had become a reflection of him, restless, consumed by the search for the whale, blind to everything else. We had no purpose other than to find Moby-Dick. The ship, once a place of work and camaraderie, had become a place of tension and fear. The air was thick with anticipation, and yet there was an undercurrent of something darker. I saw it in the eyes of the men, an unease that could not be hidden, no matter how hard they tried. And then it happened. It began with a sighting a distant spout on the horizon. The men scrambled into action, shouting to one another, preparing the boats, the harpoons, everything they would need for the chase. Ahab stood at the bow, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his face a mask of intensity. His voice rang out, sharp and clear, as he ordered the men to lower the boats. I could see the hunger in his eyes, the gleam of a man who had been driven to the edge of madness by a single goal. And in that moment, I realized something I had not fully understood until now. Ahab was not merely hunting the whale, he was hunting himself. As the boats were lowered into the water, the crew moved with a sense of urgency that bordered on frenzy. I felt it, too, the adrenaline coursing through my veins, the pull of the chase. The ocean stretched out before us, endless and wide, but in that moment it felt small, contained by the will of Ahab and the singular purpose of the hunt. The white whale had become not just a creature to be caught, but a test, a trial. It was not just a matter of survival anymore, it was a matter of conquering the very forces of nature itself. The boat I was in was rowed by a handful of the Pequod's crew, and I could see Ishmael too, in the boat ahead of me. He had been quiet for days, lost in his thoughts, but now his eyes were wide, his gaze fixed on the water ahead. The tension between us, unspoken but ever present, hung in the air. Ishmael had never shared Ahab's obsession, but I could see how the sight of the whale stirred something in him, just as it stirred something in all of us. And then it came. Moby-Dick. The great white whale, larger than any of us could have imagined. His massive body broke the surface of the water with a force that shook the air itself. The sight of him, so raw and powerful, filled the boat with a sense of awe, terror, and disbelief. It was not just a whale, it was something beyond our comprehension, something ancient, something eternal. Ahab, his face wild with triumph and fury, stood at the bow of the boat, his harpoon raised high. His voice rang out, calling to the whale, challenging it. The sea seemed to hold its breath as the boat surged forward, and the great chase began. As we drew closer to Moby-Dick, I felt a mix of fear and fascination. The whale moved with an incredible power, its massive tail slicing through the water, sending waves crashing in every direction. The men in the boats rowed furiously, but it was clear that we were no match for the whale's might. Each time we neared it, Moby-Dick would dive deep into the ocean, disappearing from sight before reappearing moments later, stronger and more determined than ever. But it was not just the whale that we were fighting. We were fighting something within ourselves, a primal force that could not be tamed. I saw it in the faces of the men, their expressions shifting from excitement to fear, from determination to doubt. The chase was no longer just about capturing Moby-Dick. It had become a fight for survival, a struggle to hold on to something that seemed to be slipping away from us with every passing moment. Ahab, however, was relentless. He would not be deterred. His obsession had taken over every part of him, and as the chase wore on, it became clear that he would stop at nothing to kill the whale. The crew, caught in the undertow of his madness, followed his every command, even as their bodies and minds were pushed to their limits. And then it happened, the first strike. Ahab's harpoon pierced the side of Moby-Dick, and for a moment everything seemed to freeze. The whale thrashed in pain, its massive body writhing in the water, and the boat rocked violently as the crew struggled to maintain control. Ahab, his face filled with triumph, shouted to the heavens, but the victory was short-lived. Moby-Dick was not so easily defeated. With a fury that seemed to come from the very depths of the ocean, the whale launched itself at the boat, sending it crashing into the sea. I felt the water engulf me, and for a moment I was lost in the dark depths. The last thing I saw before the world went black was Ahab, his harpoon still in hand, his face a mask of rage and defiance as the great whale rose from the depths, determined to make his final stand. The chase was no longer a hunt, it was a battle for our very survival. And as the waters closed in around me, I realized that none of us would leave this place unchanged. The ocean was vast, stretching endlessly beneath a sky darkened by the fury of the chase. The Pequod was a broken shell, its timbers groaning beneath the weight of the battle it had become part of. As I was tossed into the sea, I could hear the cries of my comrades, the shouts of the men, the sound of water crashing against the boat as Moby-Dick, the great white whale, fought with the ferocity of nature itself. For a moment, everything was chaos. The world seemed to spin around me, and I could feel the cold grip of the water pulling me under. The deep, dark ocean, which had once been a place of comfort, now felt like a prison. I struggled to keep afloat, my body heavy with exhaustion, my mind still reeling from the violent chaos that had erupted around us. The whale had struck us with an unrelenting force, its massive body a symbol of the very thing Ahab had sought to conquer. But in that moment, I realized that Moby-Dick was not just a whale. He was a force of nature, a force that could not be tamed by men. I was not the only one who had been thrown into the sea. Ishmael, too, had fallen overboard, his body bobbing in the waves as he struggled to stay afloat. I reached out to him, pulling him closer as we both tried to make our way back to the wreckage of the Pequod. There was no time to think, no time to question the choices that had brought us here. We were caught in the tide of a battle we could not escape, and survival had become our only concern. "Queequeg!" Ishmael called out, his voice hoarse. "What is happening?" "Is this the end?" I did not answer him at first. I could not. I was still trying to comprehend the scale of what had just transpired. We had come for a whale, a mere animal to most, but Moby-Dick had become something far more. He was a symbol of the untamable, a creature that had proven in the most brutal way that nature could not be bent to our will. Ahab's obsession had led us into the heart of the storm, and now we were all at its mercy. "We survive," I said quietly, my voice strained by the effort of keeping afloat. "We survive, and we live to tell the tale." But as we struggled against the waves, I knew the truth. Not all of us would survive. The Pequod was gone, shattered by the whale's fury, and the men who had once been so eager to follow Ahab's madness were now scattered in the sea, struggling to cling to the remnants of the ship. The battle was not over, and the greatest struggle had yet to come. We reached the wreckage of the Pequod, clinging to the floating debris as the storm raged on around us. The wind howled, the waves crashed against us, and in the distance we could hear the sound of Moby-Dick as he circled, his presence still looming, a reminder of the hunt we had begun so long ago. The whale was not finished with us. He had claimed his victory, but he was not done. And neither was Ahab. Ishmael and I were not the only survivors. A handful of men had managed to cling to the wreckage, and as we drifted in the open sea, we began to speak in whispers, our voices heavy with the weight of what we had witnessed. But there was no time for mourning, no time for grief. The whale had not yet finished his work, and Ahab, obsessed, maddened by vengeance, would not rest until the battle was over. Ahab's presence had haunted us even in our moments of quiet. It was impossible to forget the intensity of his gaze, the way his voice had stirred us all to action. But now, in the aftermath, I wondered, was Ahab truly the man we had followed, or was he simply a reflection of something darker within us all? And then, as the darkness of night settled over the sea, we heard it. The sound of Ahab's voice, calling out across the waters, his words lost in the howling wind. To me, the whale must die!" The words were sharp and clear, cutting through the storm like a knife. I turned to Ishmael, my eyes wide with disbelief. How could Ahab still be alive? Had he survived the madness of the battle, or had he come to claim the final piece of his vengeance, even if it meant his own destruction? The thought of Ahab, driven by nothing but the need to kill the whale, sent a shiver through me. It was clear that Ahab had become something more than a man. He had become a force of nature, as relentless as the whale itself, as driven by a singular purpose as the ocean's tides. But at what cost? What had he sacrificed to reach this point? What had we all sacrificed? As the storm continued to rage, we saw him, Ahab, standing at the bow of a small boat, his harpoon raised high. The sight of him, so resolute and yet so broken, filled me with a sense of both awe and fear. He had become the embodiment of everything we had chased: vengeance, obsession, and madness. And there, in the midst of the chaos, I could see the truth. Ahab was no longer a man. He was a symbol of the human drive to conquer, to master, and to control, no matter the cost. He was chasing something beyond Moby-Dick, beyond the whale. He was chasing himself, and in the process, he had lost everything. As Ahab launched his harpoon at the whale, I realized that this was no longer a hunt. It was a battle to the death, a struggle for something far more elusive than a whale. It was a battle between man and nature, between man and the forces he could never control. I looked at Ishmael, and I knew that we were both thinking the same thing. We had been swept up in a madness that had consumed us all, and now, in the final moments of the hunt, it seemed as though nothing had changed. Ahab, for all his strength and will, had become a man lost to the sea, his soul devoured by the very thing he had sought to conquer. As I watched Ahab's harpoon fly through the air, I felt the ocean's pull once more. It was not a force we could fight. It was not a battle we could win. The sea had claimed us all, and Moby-Dick, the great whale, had become our ultimate lesson. That there are forces in this world that cannot be understood, and there are battles that no man can ever truly win. And so, the final struggle began. The battle with Moby-Dick raged on with the fury of a storm. The sea, once my familiar companion, now felt like an alien world, a place where man's power was insignificant, swallowed whole by the vastness of the ocean. I could feel it deep within my bones, the relentless pull of nature, as if the sea itself were conspiring against us, pulling us into its dark depths, drowning us in its immensity. Ahab, undeterred by the damage to the Pequod, remained steadfast in his pursuit of the white whale. His obsession had consumed him entirely. There was no longer a man in front of me. He was nothing more than the embodiment of rage, the living manifestation of a vendetta against something he could neither control nor conquer. The whale was not his enemy anymore. It was a mirror, reflecting back at him his own unyielding will, his own fatal flaw. I could see the madness in his eyes, the fire of vengeance burning so fiercely that it could not be extinguished, no matter how violently the sea tossed us around. His single-minded focus on Moby-Dick had turned him into a force of nature itself, like a violent wind or a crashing wave, unyielding and without mercy. And then, as the battle reached its peak, the final confrontation unfolded before my eyes. The harpoons flew, cutting through the air with a force that seemed to shake the very heavens. The crew of the Pequod fought valiantly, their bodies worn and weary, but driven by the need to see Ahab's dream realized. Yet every strike, every throw, seemed to do little more than anger Moby-Dick, who lashed out with a fury that only grew with each attack. The massive creature dove beneath the waves, then emerged again, sending waves crashing into the boats and shaking them to their core. For a moment, there was silence. The wind ceased, the water stilled, and it was as though time itself had frozen in place. But only for a moment. Then, as if nature could not hold its breath any longer, the whale emerged from the depths with a terrifying force, its enormous body cutting through the water like a dagger. Ahab stood at the bow of his boat, harpoon raised high, his face a mask of defiance. His eyes met the whale's, and in that moment I knew the final chapter of this hunt was about to be written. The clash was brutal, more violent than anything I could have ever imagined. Moby-Dick struck with the power of 1,000 storms, sending the boat spinning through the waves, its tail thrashing like a whip. Ahab, who had once been a man of flesh and blood, was now a figure of pure will, fighting for something that could not be captured, could not be controlled. The harpoon in his hand glistened in the pale light of the sun, a symbol of his endless resolve. But as the whale turned and struck the boats again, it became clear that victory was slipping further and further from our grasp. I watched helplessly as Ahab's boat was torn apart. The sound of the breaking wood echoed across the waves, mingling with the cries of the men who were now fighting to survive, not to kill. I could hear Ahab's voice above the tumult, shouting with desperation, with fury, calling the whale to him as if the creature would answer him in some way, as if it would somehow stop its endless assault. And then in one final, devastating moment, the whale reared up from the depths, its massive body twisting and turning, its eyes gleaming with a cold, unfeeling intelligence. The harpoon, which had once been the symbol of Ahab's pursuit, was now meaningless. Moby-Dick's tail struck the boat with an immense force, shattering it into pieces. I watched in horror as Ahab was thrown into the sea, his figure disappearing beneath the waves. The chaos that followed was unlike anything I had ever witnessed. The Pequod was a broken vessel, its timbers cracked and splintered, its sails torn apart by the storm of violence that had consumed it. The crew was scattered, drowning in the wreckage, their voices lost in the roar of the ocean. Moby-Dick had done what no man could have done. He had crushed the pursuit, shattered the dream, and reminded us all of the one truth we could never escape. The ocean, nature itself, was beyond our control. I found myself once again in the water, struggling to keep afloat, my body battered by the force of the storm. Ishmael was beside me, barely conscious, his body limp in the water, but I could not save him, not in this vast, unforgiving sea. There was nothing we could do now but survive, to let the currents carry us wherever they would. As the night fell and the storm began to subside, I clung to the remnants of the ship. The cold wind bit at my skin, the waves crashing around me as I tried to stay afloat. I did not know how long I had been drifting, but that eventually the storm passed. The sea, which had once been so full of fury, seemed to quiet itself as if it had no more battles left to fight. And then in the distance I saw a glimmer of light. A ship, a mere silhouette against the dark sky, appeared like a ghost on the horizon. It was the Rachel, a passing vessel that had been searching for survivors. As they drew closer, I could barely keep my eyes open, my body so weary that I could hardly lift my hand to signal them. But somehow, through the darkness, I was pulled from the depths of the ocean and brought aboard the ship. And so it was that I, Queequeg, the last surviving soul of the Pequod, was rescued from the very sea that had swallowed everything else. I was the only one left to tell the tale, to bear witness to the fate that had befallen us all. But even now, as I sit here, recounting the events of that fateful journey, I still wonder, was it truly the whale that was our undoing? Or was it something within ourselves, the desire to conquer, to control, to master the forces of nature, that led us to our demise? We had set out to hunt a creature, but in the end it was the hunt that destroyed us. Moby-Dick, the great white whale, had been our teacher, our tormentor, and our final lesson. We had chased him to the ends of the earth, but in the end, he was the one who had led us back to ourselves, to the darkness within us all. The hunt is over, but the questions remain. The Rachel was a welcome sight, but it was no less a reminder of the devastation that had befallen us. The men aboard the ship were somber, their eyes hollow with exhaustion and the weight of what we had just endured. They had heard whispers of the Pequod's last voyage, and when they saw me, the last of the crew, adrift in the open sea, they knew that the rumours had been true. But there were no words for what we had experienced, no language for the horrors we had witnessed. I too had no words, only a strange numbness that had taken hold of me, as though the sea had stripped me of everything but my survival. The Rachel was not much more than a shadow in comparison to the Pequod. It was smaller, quieter, its men a different breed less seasoned by the extremes of the open ocean. Yet the ship was a lifeline, and I held on to it with the last remnants of my will. My body ached, my spirit broken, but my mind still wandered back to the wreckage of the Pequod, to Ahab's final, desperate cry as he was swallowed by the waves. I had witnessed the end of a dream, the conclusion of a man's obsession, and the destruction of a ship that had once been full of life. But what was the meaning of it all? What had Ahab truly sought, and what had we lost in following him? These questions haunted me in the quiet moments, as I sat in the shadows of the Rachel, staring out at the endless horizon. The ocean was calm now, a deceptive peace that only added to the weight of my thoughts. Ishmael too had survived, though in a state far worse than mine. He was injured, weak, and drifting in and out of consciousness. But as we sat together, the last two men left from the doomed crew of the Pequod, I could not help but notice the change in him. He too had been touched by the madness of the hunt, though in a quieter way than Ahab. Ishmael had not been consumed by obsession. He had merely been caught in the undertow, drawn into something much larger than himself. But now, in the aftermath, he was a different man. The sea had marked him, just as it had marked the rest of us. "Queequeg," he said one night, his voice faint and trembling. "What do we do now? What do we have left?" I didn't have an answer for him. What could I say? That the hunt had ended, and we had survived? That Moby-Dick had been slain, but at what cost? The whale, in his final act, had turned the Pequod into a memory, leaving only wreckage behind. Ahab, whose thirst for vengeance had led us all to the edge of destruction, was gone, and the men who had followed him were now either dead or lost to the sea, leaving no trace of their lives behind but the ghosts of their obsession. "We keep moving," I said, though the words felt hollow. "We keep moving forward, for there is nothing else to do." The truth was, I had no answers. I had seen too much, experienced too much to believe that there was any simple explanation. The hunt had started as a pursuit of something physical, an animal, a beast to be conquered. But as it had progressed, it had become something else entirely. The chase for Moby-Dick had turned into a metaphor for something much deeper: the need for control, the desire to conquer nature, to master the forces that governed our lives. And in the end, Ahab's obsession had consumed him, his mind unraveling under the weight of it all. We had all followed him, each of us driven by some unspoken desire, some need to prove something, to overcome something within ourselves. But now, with the hunt over, I understood the price of such a pursuit. Moby-Dick had not simply been a whale, he had been a reflection of something within us all, something primal and uncontrollable. We had chased him, yes, but in doing so, we had also been chasing our own destruction. As I sat on the Rachel, watching the sea stretch out before me, I could not shake the feeling that the ocean was more than just a body of water. It was a force, one that could not be bent to our will, one that did not care for our ambitions, our dreams, or our desires. The sea had taken Ahab, had taken the Pequod, and had taken the men who had sailed with us. But it had not taken Menot yet. Ishmael was quiet, lost in his own thoughts, but I could see the same questions in his eyes that haunted me. We were the last survivors, the ones left to carry the memory of what had happened. We had lived through the madness, but would we ever be able to truly understand it? Would we ever be able to find peace after what we had experienced? The days that followed were a blur. The Rachel made its way back towards civilization, though it felt like we were returning from a place far beyond the reach of any man. We were not the same men who had boarded the Pequod. We were changed, scarred by the hunt, by the storm that had swept us all away. But perhaps the greatest change had come in the form of something we could not see, something within ourselves. The hunt for Moby-Dick had been more than just a chase. It had been a test, one that had revealed the darkness within us all. It had shown us that the greatest enemy we face is not the whale, but the forces within us that drive us toward destruction. The thirst for vengeance, the desire for power, the obsession with control, all of these things had led us to the end of our journey. As the Rachel approached land, I knew that I would never be the same. The sea had taken much from me, but it had also given me something, an understanding of the fragile nature of life, of the dangers of obsession, and of the ultimate futility of trying to control the world around us. Moby-Dick had shown us that, in the end, we are all at the mercy of forces far greater than ourselves. Ishmael and I were the only ones left to tell the tale, but even now, as I recount it, I cannot help but wonder, what did we truly learn from the hunt? Was it worth it? Did we conquer Moby-Dick, or did Moby-Dick conquer us? The questions remain as endless as the sea itself. As the Rachel neared the coast, the landscape before us began to shift from the endless expanse of ocean to the familiar shores of civilization. But there was no joy in my heart as I looked upon that land. It was not the land of comfort or safety that I had once known. It was a land that seemed distant, alien, untouched by the chaos we had endured. The sea had claimed more than our ship and our comrades. It had claimed our connection to the world we once knew. Ishmael and I were the last to speak of the Pequod, the last to bear witness to what had happened on that doomed ship. The others, though they had survived, could not seem to comprehend the magnitude of what we had experienced. For them, it was simply another sea voyage, another chapter in their lives. But for Ishmael and me, it had been something far more. We had been touched by the sea in ways that no one else could understand. It had shown us the best and the worst of humanity, and we had learned that some truths were too deep to ever fully comprehend. I found myself walking the decks of the Rachel in silence, my mind still drifting back to the final moments of the Pequod. The images of Moby-Dick, of the white whale crashing through the waves with the power of a god, still haunted me. The sound of Ahab's voice, calling out in his final moment of rage and defiance, echoed in my ears. But the whale had been the true victor in that battle. Moby-Dick had not been defeated, not by Ahab's obsession, not by the crew's fury. He had survived, and in his survival he had given us all a lesson in humility. What was it that had driven us all to the edge of madness? Was it the power of the sea, the lure of the unknown, or was it simply that we could not accept our place in the grand design of things? Ahab had believed that by killing Moby-Dick, he could overcome the forces of nature, that he could impose his will upon the ocean. But in the end, the ocean had proven its power. The sea, in all its fury, had swallowed Ahab, and it had swallowed the Pequod whole. The whale had been the embodiment of nature's fury, but it was also the embodiment of its indifference. As I stood on the deck staring at the horizon, I could not help but reflect on the lessons Moby-Dick had taught us. The whale was not just a creature of the sea, he was a symbol of nature's untamable power, of the limits of human ambition, of the fragility of life itself. And in our pursuit of him, we had learned that no matter how much we tried to control our world, there were forces far greater than us. Forces we could never conquer. Ishmael, who had been silent for much of the journey, came to stand beside me. His eyes were distant, lost in thought, just as mine had been for so long. We had both been touched by the sea, but in different ways. For him, the journey had been one of curiosity, a search for meaning. For me, it had been something else, a journey that had begun with a thirst for adventure, but had ended with a deeper understanding of life's most painful truths. "We've seen things, Queequeg," Ishmael said softly, his voice carrying the weight of the journey. "Things no one should ever have to see. And yet here we are, the last of them." I nodded, though I didn't have the words to answer him. What could I say? That I had learned nothing? That the ocean, the whale, had given me no answers? Or that I had learned too much, that I had seen the true face of nature, and it was neither kind nor cruel, but simply indifferent? "We live, Ishmael," I said quietly, my voice barely a whisper. "We live, and we tell the tale." But even as I said the words, I knew they were hollow. There was no redemption in surviving the Pequod, no victory in having outlived the madness of Ahab and the death of the ship. The sea had claimed what it had claimed, and it had left behind only the survivors, the ones who had witnessed the end, who had seen the depths of obsession, the cost of pursuit, and the consequences of defying the natural order. As the Retolder docked and we were pulled from the ocean's embrace, I felt a strange emptiness settle over me. The land, which had once seemed so distant, now seemed alien and cold. The people on the shore were mere shadows of the life I had known, their faces unfamiliar, their concerns trivial in comparison to the storm that had raged within us all. The sea had given me everything and taken it all away. Ishmael and I walked down the dock in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. He, I could tell, was already contemplating the journey that lay ahead. He was a man of words, of stories, of finding meaning where others saw none. And perhaps in time he would write the tale of the Pequod, of Ahab, and of Moby-Dick. Perhaps he would give it meaning, just as he had given it form in his mind. For me, though, I could not look back. The ocean had taken enough from me. It had claimed my soul in a way I could not explain, and now it would stay with me forever. The lessons it had taught me were written in the waves, carved into the very fabric of the sea. I would not forget them. But I would not return to them either. I had been part of the madness, part of the hunt. But now I would simply live. I would survive. And that for me was enough. As the Rachel sailed away from the shore, I glanced back at the land that had once seemed so foreign to me. Now it seemed so small, so insignificant in the grand scheme of things. The ocean was my home now, my constant companion, and though the hunt for Moby-Dick had ended, the lessons of the sea would never leave me. They would live in me, as they lived in the waves, as they lived in the hearts of all men who dared to challenge the ocean's depths. The chase was over, but the questions remained. In the days that followed our rescue, life aboard the Rachel seemed to drift by in a haze. The crew, though grateful to be alive, bore the heavy weight of what had transpired on the Pequod. There were no celebrations, no joyful reunions. There was only the quiet understanding that we had returned from something beyond the ordinary, something that would haunt us for the rest of our lives. For those who had witnessed the madness of Ahab and the fury of Moby-Dick, the sea was no longer a symbol of adventure and discovery. It was a mirror reflecting back at us the worst of our desires, our obsessions, our fears. Ishmael and I spent much of our time together, though neither of us spoke much. We were like two ghosts adrift in a world that had not changed, but which had become unrecognizable to us. The land, with its bustling cities and busy streets, felt alien, out of place. There were no storms here, no wild waves to crash against the hull of a ship, no whales to chase. Instead, there was a quiet, almost suffocating stillness, a calm that seemed to mock the violence we had experienced on the open ocean. But it was in this stillness that I began to feel something stir within me. It wasn't grief, nor was it regret. It was something deeper, something harder to define. Ahab's madness had taken us to the edge of destruction, but it had also shown us the truth of our own mortality. It had stripped us of everything we thought we knew about ourselves, leaving us raw, exposed, and forever changed. We had been part of something that was both terrible and awe-inspiring, and in the wake of that experience, nothing seemed quite as important or as real as it once had. One evening, as we sat by the docks, Ishmael finally spoke. He had been silent for days, lost in his thoughts, but now his voice was filled with a quiet resolve. "Queequeg," he began, his gaze distant. "Do you think we'll ever truly understand what we experienced out there? Will we ever find the answers we're looking for?" I looked out at the horizon, where the sun dipped in below the edge of the world, casting long shadows over the sea. The ocean seemed to stretch on forever, its surface calm now, but I knew better than to trust its stillness. Beneath that calm was a force far greater than anything we could comprehend. "I don't know," I replied quietly. "Maybe we weren't meant to understand it. Maybe that's the lesson the whale was trying to teach us. There are forces in this world that no man can conquer, no matter how hard he tries. Some things are beyond our control, beyond our understanding." Ishmael nodded slowly, as if he had already come to the same conclusion. "I've always thought there was a meaning to everything. But now I'm not so sure. Maybe we're just drifting, just like the sea. Maybe there is no grand purpose. Maybe we're all just chasing our own Moby-Dick." The words hung in the air between us, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. The sound of the waves lapping against the shore seemed to echo the quiet in my heart. We had been part of something that had transcended the ordinary, but in the end, it had left us with more questions than answers. Ishmael's words were not comforting, but they were true. We had gone to sea to seek adventure, to seek purpose, but all we had found was a confrontation with our own human frailty. The sea had shown us that there were no easy answers, no simple solutions. The hunt for Moby-Dick had not been a noble quest. It had been a pursuit of madness, a pursuit that had cost us everything. And now, as we sat on the shores of civilization, we were left to pick up the pieces of our shattered lives. But there was still a part of me that could not let go of the lessons Moby-Dick had taught us. The whale had shown us the darkness within ourselves, but it had also shown us the power of nature, of forces that could not be tamed. Ahab had sought to conquer that power, but in the end, he had been consumed by it. And I wondered, could any of us truly understand the ocean, or were we simply its playthings drifting helplessly in its wake? The sun had set by the time Ishmael and I rose from our seats. The darkness of night had begun to settle over the land, and with it came a sense of finality. We had survived the hunt, but what had we truly gained? What did we have left now that Moby-Dick was gone? Now that the Pequod was no more? Ishmael turned to me as we began walking toward the docks. "I suppose we'll never know the full extent of what happened," he said quietly. "But maybe it's better that way. Maybe some questions don't need answers," I nodded. "Maybe. But I don't think the question ever really leaves you. It stays with you, like the sea. Even when you're ashore, you can still hear it calling." We walked in silence for a while longer, each of us lost in our thoughts, but connected by something unspoken. The sea had changed us, and no matter how far we sailed from it, we would never be the same again. As we reached the end of the dock, Ishmael stopped and looked back at the water, his gaze lingering on the horizon. "Maybe we were never meant to conquer Moby-Dick," he said softly. "Maybe we were just meant to see him, to understand that there are things in this world that cannot be tamed." I watched him for a moment, then looked back at the sea. It was quiet now, a soft murmur beneath the stars. The ocean was still vast, still indifferent, but I no longer felt the need to conquer it. I had learned the hard way that some forces were beyond our control. We were not meant to dominate the sea or Moby-Dick. We were merely meant to live in it, to survive it. And as I stood there, watching the moonlight shimmer on the water, I knew that the hunt was truly over. The lessons of the whale had been learned, and there was no need to chase them any longer. We had come face to face with nature's fury, and now we could only move forward, carrying the weight of the past with us, but not allowing it to consume us. The journey had ended, but the questions remained, floating on the surface of the sea, just beyond our reach. Days turned into weeks, and the town we had docked in began to feel like another world, far removed from the chaos of the Pequod, from the storms we had weathered, and from the madness that had once consumed Ahab. Life on land seemed strange now, almost unreal. The sounds of bustling streets and clinking coins felt as distant as a forgotten dream. I, Queequeg, had once known the rhythms of the sea, the pulse of the ocean beneath my feet. But now, on solid ground, it felt as though my very soul was adrift, untethered, and lost. Ishmael and I spent our days in a kind of muted silence, as if we both feared that speaking too much about what we had witnessed would make it more real, more impossible to bear. I had seen men survive great battles, but none of them had been changed as we had been. The Pequod was gone, swallowed by the depths of the ocean, but its memory remained, clinging to us, wrapping itself around our hearts and minds like a weight we could not escape. Ishmael, ever the observer, had become consumed with the idea of telling the story. He had started to write, scribbling furiously in the evenings, his pen moving as if it were the only thing that could release the flood of memories trapped within him. I could see the pain in his eyes as he wrote, but I also saw the determination, the need to make sense of what had happened, to capture the enormity of the hunt and the madness that had driven us all. I often wondered why he needed to write it down, why we both felt this compulsion to carry the weight of the tale with us. It wasn't just for the world to know, it was for us, for our own understanding, for our own closure. But no matter how much we wrote, no matter how many pages filled with ink, I knew there was no way to make the story anything more than a shadow of what it had been. The truth of what we had experienced was too vast to capture in words, too heavy to be bound between the covers of a book. Ishmael spent countless hours in his room, alone with his thoughts and his pen. I, on the other hand, wandered the town, trying to ground myself in a reality that seemed too small, too fragile to contain everything I had seen. Everywhere I went, I heard snippets of conversation about other voyages, other adventures, but none of them seemed to hold any meaning anymore. They were all so trivial compared to what we had experienced. I think it was during one of these solitary walks, when the sky was heavy with the promise of rain, that I truly began to understand the full weight of our journey. It was not just the loss of Ahab, the loss of the Pequod, or even the loss of the men we had once sailed with. It was the loss of innocence itself, the understanding that we had been part of something much greater than ourselves, something we could not have hoped to control. We had sought to master nature, to conquer a force beyond our understanding, but Moby-Dick had shown us the futility of such an endeavor. The whale had been both a symbol and a reality, a force of nature that could not be bent to our will, a reminder that there were things in this world that were beyond human comprehension, beyond human control. And yet, despite knowing this, despite having faced the wrath of the whale, we still sought to understand it. We still sought to chase it. As I walked through the town, the images of the Pequod and Moby-Dick flashed before my eyes. Ahab, standing at the bow, his face a mask of fury and obsession. The whale rising from the depths, its massive body breaking the surface with a force that could shatter the very world. And then, the final strike. The end of it all. Ahab swallowed by the sea, his dream destroyed. His legacy, nothing more than a tragic tale. The men who had followed him into the madness were gone, their names lost to the waves. I stopped at the edge of the town where the land met the sea and looked out at the horizon. The ocean stretched endlessly before me, a vast, unyielding expanse. It was the same ocean that had taken everything from us, and yet it was the one thing that remained unchanged. The sea had seen everything: Ahab's obsession, the destruction of the Pequod, the death of a dream. But it would continue, as it always had, indifferent to the lives of men. It was then that I realized that perhaps that was the true lesson of Moby-Dick, not that we could conquer the whale or nature or even ourselves, but that we could never truly control anything. The sea, the whale, and even Ahab were all reflections of the same truth, that life is fleeting, that our pursuits, no matter how noble or obsessive, are small in comparison to the vastness of the world around us. As I stood there, lost in my thoughts, I felt the weight of the tale that Ishmael was writing, the weight of everything we had experienced, settling on my shoulders. It was a burden that I had not asked for, but one that I could not escape. And in that moment I understood why we had to tell the story, why Ishmael had to write it down, why I had to bear witness to it. We had lived through something that no one would ever truly understand, and it was our duty, our responsibility, to share it. Not for glory, not for fame, but simply because it was a part of us. It was a part of what it meant to be human. As I turned to walk back to the town, I knew that I would never be the same. The ocean had changed me. It had shown me the dark, unfathomable depths of the human soul, the places we are afraid to go. And though I could never forget the lessons it had taught me, I knew that I could never return to the life I had once known. The hunt for Moby-Dick had ended, but the story would never end. The tale of Ahab, of the Pequod, and of the great white whale would live on, passed down through the generations, a reminder of the dangers of obsession, the futility of control, and the power of nature that we can never truly tame. And as I walked back into the town, I could only wonder, what would become of us now that we had learned the truth? Would we continue to chase after our own Moby-Dicks? Or would we finally understand that some things are better left untouched? Some battles better left unfought? I did not know. But I knew one thing. The questions would linger, as endless as the sea itself. As the days passed, Ishmael continued to write, pouring his thoughts into the pages with an urgency that reflected the storm still brewing inside him. He had become more absorbed in his writing than ever before, as though it was the only way to make sense of what we had witnessed, the only way to bring meaning to the madness that had consumed us all. I often found him hunched over in his room, his pen moving furiously across the paper, his brow furrowed in concentration. I wondered if he was searching for answers that would never come, or if he was simply trying to exorcise the demons that still haunted him. I could not bring myself to write. My thoughts, though clear, were too heavy to put into words. The ocean had taken so much from us, and yet I could not escape it. It lingered in my mind, in my dreams, in the very air I breathed. I had once known the sea as a place of freedom, of adventure, but now it felt like a prison, one from which there was no escape. The waves that had once called to me now seemed to mock me, reminding me of everything I had lost. I would walk along the shore, watching the waves crash against the rocks, and I would think of Ahab, of his madness, of his obsession. He had been a man consumed by a single idea, a single goal, and in the end, that goal had destroyed him. I had once wondered if Ahab had ever truly known what he was chasing, or if the chase itself had become his only purpose. I had thought he sought vengeance, but now I wondered if he had been searching for something deeper, something that could never be found in the body of a whale. But the truth was, none of us knew. None of us knew what drove Ahab or what drove us. We had all joined the hunt for our own reasons, but in the end, it was the sea that had claimed us, just as it had claimed the Pequod. The ocean was indifferent to our ambitions, to our desires, to our dreams. It simply moved endlessly, as it always had, indifferent to the lives of men. The sea had swallowed Ahab, had swallowed the ship, and had left only the wreckage behind. The question lingered in my mind, was it truly the whale that we had been chasing? Or was it something else entirely, something within ourselves that we could not name, but that had driven us all to the brink of madness? Ishmael's writing had become a way for him to make sense of all this, to process the madness we had witnessed. But I could not help but feel that there were no words that could ever capture the truth of what we had been through. The whale had not just been a creature of the sea, it had been a symbol, a reflection of the very forces that had driven us to the edge of destruction. And now that the hunt was over, I could not help but wonder what, if anything, we had learned. I turned my gaze to the horizon, where the ocean stretched out endlessly before me, as if it were daring me to find meaning in its depths. The sea was silent now, the storm having passed, but the silence felt empty, like a void that could never be filled. The questions that had once driven us about fate, about vengeance, about control, now seemed insignificant in the face of the vast, unfeeling ocean. The sea had taught us that there were no easy answers, no simple solutions. We had chased the whale, but we had also chased something within ourselves, something we had not understood until it was too late. As I stood there, watching the waves roll in, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. It was not the peace of resolution, nor the peace of understanding. It was the peace of acceptance, the understanding that some things were simply beyond our control, beyond our comprehension. We had chased Moby-Dick, but we had also chased our own destruction. And now, all we could do was accept the consequences of our pursuit. Ishmael eventually joined me on the shore, his face pale and drawn from the weight of his writing. I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the toll that the story was taking on him. He had been consumed by it, just as Ahab had been consumed by his obsession with the whale. But unlike Ahab, Ishmael had survived, and in his survival I saw the possibility of something else, something beyond obsession, beyond madness. He sat beside me, his gaze following the line where the sea met the sky. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was not uncomfortable, but rather a reflection of the weight of everything we had experienced. We had seen the best and worst of ourselves, had faced the darkness within and the madness without. And now all that was left was the quiet hum of the ocean as it continued its endless journey. "Do you think we will ever find peace, Queequeg?" Ishmael asked, his voice soft, almost a whisper. I looked at him, unsure of how to answer. I had spent so much of my life seeking answers, seeking meaning in the vastness of the ocean. But now I understood that peace was not something to be found, it was something to be accepted. The ocean, the whale, and Ahab had all shown me that we were not masters of the world, but rather small, fragile creatures caught in the tide of forces far greater than ourselves. "We may never find peace," I replied quietly, "but we can learn to live with the questions. That is all we can do." And in that moment, I knew that we had learned the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes the journey is more important than the destination. The hunt for Moby-Dick had been a pursuit of meaning, of control, but in the end it had shown us that there are things in this world that cannot be controlled, that cannot be understood. The whale had taught us that, and in the silence of the sea, we had learned to accept it. As we walked back to the town, the weight of our tale heavy in our hearts, I realized that the hunt for Moby-Dick had not truly ended. It would live on in us, in the questions we carried with us, in the story Ishmael was writing. The whale, the Pequod, and Ahab, these things would never be forgotten. But perhaps in time, we would learn to live with them, to accept that some questions have no answers, and that some hunts are destined to remain unfinished. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. As the days continued to pass in this quiet town, where the sea whispered on the horizon and the sun rose each morning like a reminder of life's continuity, Ishmael and I were left with the fragments of a journey that none of us could fully comprehend. The memories of the Pequod and of Ahab, though now distant in the past, lingered like a fog that refused to lift. It was as if the ocean itself had planted its seeds deep within us, and no matter how far we drifted from it, the tides of our past would never truly cease. Ishmael's writing had taken a darker turn. At first he had written with a sense of urgency, pouring his thoughts out in an attempt to make sense of what we had witnessed. But now there was something more contemplative about his words. The questions he had once asked about the whale, about Ahab, about the nature of vengeance and obsession had given way to a deeper understanding, a reluctant acceptance of the forces that had shaped our journey. I too had begun to reflect more on what had passed. The sea, once a place of mystery and awe, now felt like a place of quiet contemplation, where every ripple, every wave carried with it the weight of what we had lost. The Pequod, Ahab, and Moby-Dick, They were all now memories, fading with the tide, and yet the lessons they imparted lingered, as if the sea had etched them into my soul, permanently carved into the very fabric of my being. I had always believed that the ocean was a place of discovery, a place where men could test their strength against nature. But after what had happened, I saw it differently. The sea was not something to be conquered. It was something to be understood, to be lived with, to be respected. Ahab had sought to dominate it, to impose his will upon it, and in the end, the ocean had swallowed him whole. Moby-Dick, the great whale, had been a symbol of that same force and untamable power that no man could hope to control. And yet we had tried, we had chased it, followed it, pursued it with a zeal that blinded us to everything else. As I stood on the shore watching the waves crash against the rocks, I began to realize that the ocean's true power was not in its ability to destroy, but in its indifference. It did not care for Ahab's vengeance, nor for our quest. It simply moved, ebbing and flowing with a rhythm older than time itself. It was that rhythm, that constant motion, that had drawn us all in. It was the same rhythm that had kept Ahab's obsession alive, even as the rest of us began to falter. And it was that rhythm that now haunted me. Ishmael's voice broke through my thoughts, soft and measured. Queequeg, do you ever wonder if we could have turned back? If we had known from the very beginning where this would lead, would we have still gone? Would we have still followed Ahab into the madness? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I stood there, my eyes fixed on the horizon, the familiar pull of the ocean drawing me in, just as it had always done. The question Ishmael asked was one I had asked myself countless times in the days that followed the Pequod's destruction. Could we have stopped Ahab? Could we have turned back before the final confrontation with Moby-Dick? The answer was elusive, slipping through my fingers like water, impossible to grasp. But what I had come to understand after all the suffering and loss was that the choice had not been ours to make. Ahab had chosen his path long before we ever set foot on the Pequod. He had chosen to chase Moby-Dick with a single-mindedness that left no room for doubt, no room for other possibilities. We, the crew, had followed him not out of loyalty to the man, but out of our own need for something greater than ourselves, something to believe in, something to fight for. But in doing so, we had bound ourselves to Ahab's fate. Ishmael looked at me, his eyes searching mine for an answer. Do you think Ahab would have stopped if we had asked him to? Do you think, at the end, he realized what he had done? I shook my head slowly. I don't think Ahab ever saw the truth of what he was chasing. He believed that Moby-Dick was the enemy, that the whale was a force of evil that had to be destroyed. But in the end, Moby-Dick was just a symbol, a reflection of his own darkness. Ahab had already lost himself before the chase began, and in his madness he dragged us all into the depths with him. The words hung between us, heavy and full of meaning. Ahab's pursuit had been a pursuit of vengeance, but it had also been a search for meaning, something to give his life purpose, something to justify his suffering. In his obsession, he had believed that conquering Moby-Dick would give him mastery over his fate, but in the end, he had only been consumed by it, his life reduced to a single, tragic pursuit. I looked at Ishmael, who had grown quiet, his mind lost in thought. He had always been a man of words, a man who sought meaning in the world around him. But I could see the toll the journey had taken on him. The hunt for Moby-Dick had not just been a battle with the whale, it had been a battle with himself, with his own doubts, his own search for answers. And now, as he sat beside me, I knew that the journey had changed him, just as it had changed me. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The waves continued to crash against the shore. their rhythmic pounding a constant reminder of the sea's power, its indifference to the lives of men. We had been part of something that was both terrible and beautiful, something that had consumed us all and left us broken, but still alive. The hunt was over, but the questions remained. Could we ever find peace after everything we had seen? Could we ever reconcile the madness of the hunt with the quiet of the shore? Or would we forever be haunted by the shadow of Moby-Dick, a reminder of our own obsession and the cost of chasing the impossible? I didn't know the answers, but perhaps, in time, we would find them just as we had found the whale. For now, all we could do was live with the questions, just as the sea lived with its endless tides. The days that followed our return to civilization felt like an extended pause, a breath caught between the violent past and an uncertain future. The Rachel had brought us back to land, but it could not free us from the memories of the Pequod and the great white whale. Each morning, as I awoke to the sound of gulls and the distant call of ships docking in the harbour, I felt a strange sense of displacement. The world had not changed, yet I had. The rhythm of the sea that had once been a source of comfort now felt like a reminder of something that could never be undone. Ishmael had returned to his writing, his hand more steady now than it had been in the days immediately following our rescue. The words came to him in a torrent, flowing from his mind in a way I had not seen before. It was as if the very act of writing was a kind of purging, an attempt to make sense of the chaos that had filled our lives. I had long since ceased to join him in his writing. My thoughts, though they were many, felt like they were too heavy to be captured by words. And so I spent my days in silence, walking along the shore, or sitting in the quiet corners of the town, reflecting on the past with no real hope of understanding it. The ocean had always been a place of discovery for me, a place where one could find the mysteries of life, the truths hidden beneath the surface. But after what had happened, I began to see the ocean differently. It was no longer a symbol of adventure nor of freedom. It was a mirror, a reflection of the chaos within us all. The sea had shown us that no matter how much we sought to control it, no matter how much we fought against its currents, it would always remain a force beyond our understanding. As the weeks passed, I found myself thinking less about the hunt and more about the lessons it had imparted. Ahab's obsession had consumed him, had led him down a path from which there was no return, but we, the survivors, had been given another chance. And yet, I wondered, what was the point of surviving if we had learned nothing from the journey? What had we really gained in the end? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned to shades of purple and gold, I found myself standing at the edge of the sea once more. The waves rolled in, their steady rhythm soothing yet haunting. I could hear Ishmael's voice behind me, his footsteps soft on the sand as he approached. "I have finished it, Queequeg," he said quietly, his voice filled with a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. "The tale, it's done." I turned to face him, my eyes meeting his with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "And what have you written, Ishmael?" He paused for a moment, as if considering how to answer. "I've written what we saw, what we felt, what we lost. I've written it all, every moment of madness, every wave of the sea. And yet I know that even with all these words, there's no way to truly capture it, no way to make anyone understand the depths of what we experienced." I nodded, understanding what he meant. No words, no matter how carefully chosen, could ever fully encapsulate the madness of the hunt, the desperation in Ahab's eyes, or the raw power of Moby-Dick. It was a story that could never be told completely, for it had been a journey into the heart of the unknown, a journey that had changed us in ways we could not explain. "You've done what you can," I said softly, "but in the end it's not about telling the story, is it? It's about what we do with it now. We can write it, speak of it, remember it, but the real question is, what have we learned from it?" Ishmael didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the water, his feet leaving soft prints in the sand as he gazed out at the ocean. I followed him, standing beside him in silence. The sea was calm now, the waves gentle as they lapped against the shore. But there was a weight in the air, as if the ocean itself was waiting for something, waiting for us to understand. "I think about Ahab," Ishmael said after a long while, "about his obsession, about the way he thought he could control everything, bend it to his will, but he couldn't, could he? He couldn't even control himself in the end." "No," I said, my voice low. "He couldn't." And that was his downfall. He mistook control for power, and in the end, he had neither. We stood there in silence, the ocean stretching out before us like an endless expanse. I felt the weight of our journey settling over me, the realization that it had not just been a chase for a whale, but a chase for something far more elusive, something that had driven us all to the brink of madness. But in the end, there was no conquest, no victory. There was only the quiet knowledge that we had been part of something beyond our understanding, something that had left its mark on us forever. "Do you think we'll ever find peace, Queequeg?" Ishmael asked, his voice soft, almost lost in the sound of the waves. "I don't know," I replied, my gaze fixed on the horizon. "I think peace comes from acceptance, Ishmael, from knowing that there are things we cannot change, things we cannot control. We cannot undo what has happened, but we can learn from it. We can move forward, knowing that the ocean, the whale, Ahab, they were all part of something greater than us." "And what about the hunt?" Ishmael asked. What about Moby-Dick?" I paused, considering the question. "The hunt is over, but the story remains. We carry it with us, wherever we go. And in the end, that is what defines us, not the whale, not Ahab, but how we choose to live with the lessons we've learned." The wind blew softly across the shore, and I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. The hunt for Moby-Dick was over, but its shadow would follow us for the rest of our lives. The sea had taught us many things, but perhaps the most important lesson was that some things are beyond our control. The ocean would continue to roll, the waves would continue to crash, and the story of the Pequod would live on, passed from one generation to the next. A reminder of the madness of obsession and the cost of chasing the impossible. As Ishmael and I stood there, watching the last light of day fade into the darkness, I knew that the story was not truly over. The hunt may have ended, but the questions would remain, floating on the surface of the sea, just beyond our reach. The days that followed our conversation by the sea were uneventful, or at least, they appeared so on the surface. The quiet town began to feel like a distant memory of another life, one where the sea was not a constant presence, and where the weight of the Pequod's fate had not settled so deeply in my chest. Yet even as the world around me moved in its familiar rhythm, I felt an undercurrent of change within myself, an inner turbulence I could neither escape nor fully understand. Ishmael continued to write, his obsession with capturing the story of the Pequod and Ahab's madness growing deeper with each passing day. He had turned inward, buried in his own thoughts as he tried to weave meaning from the tangled threads of our experience. But even in his writing, there was something more, something that hinted at a restlessness that would not be quieted, not even by the catharsis of words. I often found myself drifting to the water's edge, where the sea met the land in a never-ending dance of waves. I could spend hours watching the horizon, the line where sky and sea merged into one, as if it were the boundary between worlds I had once known and one that I could never fully return to. The ocean was both a comfort and a reminder of what we had lost. It was vast, limitless, and indifferent, everything Ahab had sought to conquer, and everything I had learned to accept. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon in a blaze of orange and gold, I walked alone along the shore, lost in my thoughts. The sound of the waves, gentle yet persistent, filled the air, drowning out the noise of the world behind me. In that moment, I found myself thinking of Ahab, not just of the man, but of the myth he had become. Ahab, whose obsession with Moby-Dick had driven him to madness, had sought to master the one thing no man could master. He had pursued the whale as if it were the key to his salvation, his redemption. But in the end, it was the thing that had destroyed him. It occurred to me then, as I watched the sea stretch endlessly before me, that Ahab had never really been chasing Moby-Dick at all. He had been chasing something deeper, something more intangible, a need to prove that he could bend the world to his will, that he could conquer the forces that had always been beyond his control. But the sea and the whale within it had shown him that no matter how much we try to impose our desires on the world, there are forces that will always remain beyond us. I had once believed that Ahab's obsession with the whale was the product of his anger, of his thirst for vengeance. But now I saw it differently. Ahab's obsession was not born of hate, but of fear, a fear of being powerless, a fear of being at the mercy of something greater than himself. He had spent his life trying to control what could not be controlled, and in the end that very desire had consumed him. As the last light of the sun faded from the sky, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The ocean, in all its vastness and mystery, had become both a symbol and a teacher. It had taught me that there are things in this world we cannot understand, things we cannot conquer, no matter how much we try. The hunt for Moby-Dick had been a quest for meaning, but in the end it had shown us that meaning is often elusive, fleeting, and beyond our grasp. I turned to head back to the town, my thoughts still swirling. The questions that had haunted me since the moment we set sail on the Pequod were no closer to being answered, but perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the hunt, the pursuit of the whale, was not about finding answers at all. Perhaps it was about the journey itself, about confronting the forces within us that we cannot see and learning to live with them, even when they seem beyond our control. Ishmael was waiting for me in the small room we shared in the inn, his pen poised over a fresh sheet of paper. He looked up as I entered, his tired eyes reflecting the same quiet understanding that had settled within me. "It's done, Queequeg," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of his journey. "I've written it all down, the tale. But I don't know if it's enough. I don't know if any of it makes sense." I sat down across from him, the room dimly lit by the soft glow of a lantern. I didn't have an answer for him, but I understood. We had both been changed by the hunt, by the ocean, by the lessons we had learned in the pursuit of Moby-Dick. And no matter how much we wrote, no matter how much we spoke of it, we could never truly capture the magnitude of what we had experienced. The hunt was a reflection of the human condition itself, of our need for meaning, for control, for mastery over our lives. And in the end, it was a reminder that sometimes the things we chase will elude us forever. "We've told the story," I said quietly, looking out the window at the sea. But I think the real lesson is that we don't need to understand everything. The ocean doesn't care if we understand it. The whale doesn't care if we conquer it. Some things are beyond us, and that's something we have to accept. Ishmael nodded, his eyes softening. Perhaps you're right. Maybe the point was never to catch Moby-Dick, but to realize that the hunt is part of who we are. We chase things because we believe they will give us meaning, but the truth is, the meaning comes from the chase itself. It's about the journey, not the destination. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of the story settling over us like the evening fog. The tale of Moby-Dick was one that would live on, told and retold by those who came after us. But for us, the journey was over. The whale, the obsession, the madness, it was all behind us now. And what remained was the quiet realization that we had been part of something far larger than ourselves. As the last light of the day faded from the sky, I knew that we could never truly escape the shadow of the whale. But perhaps in time we would learn to live with it. The ocean would continue to roll, the waves would continue to crash, and the questions we carried with us would remain, floating on the surface of the sea, just beyond our reach. The Rachel had long since left the shores of the town, its sails fading into the distance, just like the memory of the Pequod. The sea, though always there, now seemed distant. The horizon, where once I had glimpsed our doom, had faded to a point on the edge of the world. Time had begun to do what time always does, to soften the edges of our pain, to make things seem smaller than they once were. Yet the questions remained deep within me, buried like stones at the bottom of the ocean. What had the hunt for Moby-Dick been? What had it truly meant for Ahab? For us? Were we just pawns in a game too large for us to understand? Or was there some greater purpose to it alone that we could never know? Ishmael had finished his writing, though I could tell it was far from complete. It wasn't just the words that had filled the pages, but something else. He had poured his soul into that tale, just as Ahab had poured his soul into the hunt. The journey was over, but the story, like the ocean, would never truly end. It would ripple through the lives of those who read it. Just as the waves would continue to crash upon the shore, year after year, long after we were gone. In the quiet of my own thoughts, I began to understand. We had been chasing the impossible. Ahab had believed that by defeating Moby-Dick, he would gain some kind of ultimate power. But in the end, the whale had not been the enemy. It was never about the whale. It was about Ahab's need to control something that could never be controlled. It was about his desire to impose meaning on a world that did not bend to his will. And in that pursuit, he had lost everything: his ship, his crew, and ultimately, his life. And yet, despite everything, despite the madness and the destruction, there was something about that pursuit that I could not shake. The hunt for Moby-Dick had been a reflection of something larger, a reflection of the human condition. We all chase something, we all seek meaning, power, or purpose. Ahab had sought revenge. Others, like Ishmael, had sought adventure. And what had I sought? The same thing as everyone else, I suppose. A sense of belonging, a connection to the world that seemed to offer so much, yet always remained just out of reach. Ishmael and I had both been shaped by that journey, but we had come back from it in different ways. He sought to make sense of the madness, to write it all down so that others might understand. He believed that through writing he could make sense of the chaos, and perhaps in doing so, find peace. But I knew that peace would never come in that way. Some things were meant to remain beyond us. Some questions could never be answered. And the ocean, in all its vastness and mystery, would continue to hold the answers we sought. answers we could never truly grasp. I spent the following days walking the streets of the town, my feet heavy with the knowledge that I was a part of something I could never fully explain. The townsfolk went about their lives, unaware of the storm we had sailed through, unaware of the darkness that had been revealed beneath the surface of the sea. And I wondered, did they know that all of us, in our search for meaning, were chasing our own white whales? We all had our Moby-Dicks, our obsessions, our desires. And like Ahab, we too could be consumed by them if we were not careful. As time passed, I came to realize that the sea was not a place of conquest. It was not a place to seek power or control. The ocean, like life, was unpredictable, vast, and indifferent to our plans. Moby-Dick had been a lesson in humility, a lesson that would stay with me forever. There were no grand victories in the chase, no ultimate truth to be found in the hunt. There was only the journey, the chase itself, and the understanding that some things are beyond our control. One day I walked down to the beach where the waves met the shore, and I found Ishmael sitting at the water's edge, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He had finished his writing, but I could see that he was still lost in his thoughts, still trying to make sense of it all. I sat down beside him, my feet sinking into the soft sand. We both watched the waves for a long while, not speaking, letting the rhythm of the ocean soothe us. There was no need for words. The sea had already spoken to us, in ways both gentle and brutal. We had listened, and now we could do nothing but live with the lessons it had taught us. "I finished the last page," Ishmael said quietly, breaking the silence. "But even now I'm not sure what to make of it. Of Ahab, of the whale, of everything. It feels unfinished." I nodded, understanding. "It is unfinished, Ishmael. The hunt was never about the whale. It was about something we couldn't see until it was too late. But we've learned what we can, and that's all we can do." Ishmael turned to look at me, his expression thoughtful. "Do you think we'll ever find peace with it? With what happened?" "I don't know," I replied, my gaze drifting toward the horizon. "Maybe peace isn't something we find. Maybe it's something we make by accepting that some things are beyond us. The whale, the sea, Ahab's obsession, they were all beyond our control. But we survived, and maybe in surviving we found something that Ahab never could." Ishmael didn't say anything more. He simply nodded and returned his gaze to the ocean, the waves rolling in and out as they had done for centuries. And in that moment, I understood. The journey was not over. The hunt was never truly about the whale. It had always been about our search for meaning, our quest to understand the forces that shape our lives, and the acceptance that some questions have no answers. The ocean, in all its infinite vastness, would continue to roll, the waves crashing against the shore in an eternal rhythm. And we would continue to drifting, searching, living with the lessons of the sea, and with the knowledge that some things, no matter how hard we tried, would always remain beyond our reach. And so with that understanding, we watched the sun dip below the horizon once more, knowing that the story of Moby-Dick would live on, not just in the pages of Ishmael's writing, but in our hearts and minds. For as long as we lived, the hunt was over, but the sea and its mysteries would never leave us.